Hello, guys. Welcome to our sixth session in this series of 11 sessions about the therapist training program. I'm really hoping that you guys would have gotten some value out of the trainings that we've done. And I do think there's a lot of value in just kind of revisiting some of the content that is covered. The intention is to really share openly about what does it take to be a therapist, right? What does it take to be a mental health practitioner? What are some of the details that kind of come in when you are working in this particular field? This is all the information that has been developed is all an accumulation of the journey that I have gone through as a therapist first, then someone who's been training therapists and also running a center, and I've been very privileged to have really good mentors and people who have guided me along the way. And I think, there's this intention of passing it forward. And I really hope that the content that you're gathering today, you guys really openly share it with people. Share it with your peers, share it with just the people who you feel can value from this, because one of the best ways to learn is also to teach to someone else, right? And I think that's something that we are as a culture, hopefully we're more in this abundant mindset kind of experience. Today is all about psychodynamics. It's all about transference, countertransference, Melanie Klein, particularly in terms of object relations, and also how does the therapeutic work get impacted by this, right? So those are some of the contents. If I was to be very honest, it's probably one of my favorites because I think, like how Carl Rogers said, that psychodynamic is the work. So what that primarily means is that if you're able to read transference and countertransference, which is always happening, you will be able to case conceptualize a lot better, because moving forward, the next I would imagine the next 3 days of these next three trainings, including this one that's going to be happening, it's all about case development, right? How do you language something? What are the pieces of information that you need in order to be able to really understand what is happening underneath the surface? All the stuff that we've covered prior has been, how do you have to be present as a therapist in the room? What is the regulation that is required? What is the energy that is required? What is the prep work that is required? Right? And so imagine all of that prep work is completed. Where do you go from there? How do you kind of identify what's there? Okay. Before we move forward, I have a few other updates that I would like to share in regards to the trainings, in regards to a few other things that I've been working on. And my intention is to hopefully use all of these platforms as a way of really spreading what is available in terms of trainings that you can have, in terms of other things that we've been working on. Okay. So I'll be very honest. So one thing that I'm really proud of, and something that we have been working on since the start of the year, is a software that is designed particularly to help therapists become more efficient in the work that they do. I want to share it with you before we start. So I've developed a software called Therosaur. We haven't really launched it yet. This is just a kind of a landing page for it. If you guys want to be a part of it, or at least know what this is all about, all you've got to do is just kind of sign up on the waiting list, and you guys will get updates about the different features that are there. This is particularly like an all-in-one platform designed for therapists to help them manage their client, to help them manage their payments. Each one of their clients would be given their own personalized portal. So it's a more secure way of entering your logs, sending messages to your clients, sending them reminders, having them manage their updates as well. All of those things is sort of like it's an all-in-one kind of software designed specifically for mental health practitioners. On top of that, this is also engaged, or this is also kind of integrated with AI assistance. So what it does is that it can actually use the information that you have in terms of your logs confidentially, right? So it can actually use the information and suggest to you on what you can do in your next session based on your particular therapy style. right? So for example, if you're a humanistic therapist, it will evaluate the sessions that are happening through your logs and then be able to provide suggestions in terms of how to provide effectiveness of treatment. These are just suggestions. These are designed just to provide additional support to the therapist. And again, so these are some of the features that are there. I'm really hoping that as the weeks kind of continue, I get to kind of share a little bit more about the software and all these other elements that are coming in. So I'm super excited about that. On top of that, there are other kind of like exciting uses as well. So those who are interested in becoming trauma-informed practitioners and actually trauma-informed therapists, trauma-informed life coach, we have the trauma-informed training happening on the 25th of April. We only have 20 days for that to kind of start. That's a 4-month process. It kind of builds specifically for how do you provide effective trauma-informed treatment. It's all the content that we have covered or learned from Arizona Trauma Institute, adapting it to a more of an experiential kind of base into a way in which we are able to use and implement all the content that is available in order with us that can help us become more trauma informed. Okay. I also want to apologize if there is background noise happening. There is a little bit of a construction taking place, and I'm hoping that as we continue, this construction will kind of fade off on its own. So that's the second announcement that had to kind of happen. And the third one, again, a big one, is the TRE. TRE training is confirmed. We're going to be having it in August. It's going to be a 9-month to a 2-year program, which is about somatic trauma healing. And there's no prerequisites for it. What that means is that you do not have to be a therapist in order to enroll into this. If you're someone who wants to start your career or start an absolutely new career as a mental health provider, so this is absolutely the training for you. A mental health somatic practitioner particularly. So this is the training for you. So those are all sort of like the updates that we're working on. So I'm really hoping that my intention is that once we've done with this training, we are able to give a lot more value addition to everyone who wants to continue their careers, figure out what they want to do, whether they want to continue their practice, how to improve that, whether they want to become trauma-informed therapists and become specialists, how to do that, or if they're interested in becoming a somatic practitioner and moving into that direction of somatic healing. So all of these things are meant to just kind of help you move forward in this field particularly. Okay. On that note, right? And on that note, I think we're going to start off with the topic that we have to cover today, which is about psychodynamics, right? So my intention is that I'm going to have this bias in this training that you guys have a little bit more of a pre-existing information when it comes to understanding psychoanalysis, right? The stuff that was created by Freud, right? So psychoanalysis has these kind of assumptions, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because we're moving towards a lot of the neo-Freudian stuff, which is all about the post-Freud era of psychodynamics in terms of what are some of the ways that it can work. And I do feel like some of it is really interesting. And I think as a therapist, it's the basis of the work, in my opinion. In supervision, this is what you really look for, right? And I'm going to visualize it for you guys. I'm going to show it for you guys in terms of what are some of the key concepts, and very few of them, some of the very key concepts that we have to be mindful for, and where do they come from? Okay. So we're not going to go into id, ego, superego, the unconscious and the conscious. There's this assumption that you guys have this awareness about what these things are, right? That we have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. We have an id, ego, superego, and these are some of the languages that are kind of there. When we move into transactional analysis, some of this language got shifted to parent, adult, child, and there's been this kind of natural progression of using some of Freud's earlier work to kind of really help update it to a more modernized kind of language. Psychosexual stages became Ericksonian psychosocial stages, so there are a lot of transitional elements that have happened when it comes to Freud's work, but the basis has always been sort of like of value, right? And it's just kind of built on top of it and refined it to become more effective. Okay, so based on that, where do we start from? So what we're going to do is we're going to start from one of the basic concepts which were defined as transference and countertransference, right? And so what exactly is a trauma-informed way of looking at it, right? So how like sometimes when we look at enactment, transference, countertransference, it sometimes feels so surprising, magical, that how could these things happen? How can someone be for example, someone says in the session like, I think you're reminding me of my mother, or you're reminding me of my father. Exactly, this is how it kind of comes up. I'm not sure if I am recognizing if my camera is on or off. I hope this is not for everyone. If people can kind of just confirm that for me, I'll be able to move forward. I'm just going to turn on or off, right? So I'm hoping this kind of sorts itself out. So what we're doing right now particularly is when it comes to transference and countertransference, we need to be mindful of how is the mechanism that kind of works here, right? So technically, what happens is that the our brain is wired in a manner that makes us look for things that are relevant to us, right? So for example, in order for me, the way my brain works is that I always look for familiarity. Because in order for me to find some familiarity, I find safety. So there's always this kind of radar that's kind of going around, that's kind of always looking for things at a familiar level, right? And so what happens is that specifically is designed as a threat detector. What that means is that when I go to a room, I have an anterior singular ACC, anterior singular cortex, ACC particularly. So what happens is, once you get to see the anterior singular cortex, it's a radar for the room, right? And so you scan the room. As soon as you enter, you scan the room. And what you're scanning for is cues of safety or threat. That's how the mind works, right? And so if you find a particular relevancy for a cue of safety, it could be someone's height. And these are all happening under the surface level. So these are all happening on an unconscious level. So if you find anything that is reminding you of something, that is technically that mechanism in place. Okay. And this is not something that you might have conscious awareness for. And so what happens is, as soon as your unconscious mind reminds that you of that particular situation, your nervous system, your muscle memory starts to reenact that same system. So you start to behave and respond in that same manner. And that's what creates that transferential relationship between the person and the client, right? Because what happens is that the therapist then starts to behave that way, right? That's one aspect of it. So there's one aspect of it in which we have the transference taking place. So my body is responding to the information and the familiarity that is coming in because of the person who I'm sitting in front of. I come into a room, I see this person. In order to find some sense of safety or familiarity or unsafety, in order to protect myself, my mind goes like, I know this person on some level, and this is all happening on an unconscious level. My body starts to behave in that same manner. And that is a transferential relationship that takes place. This person, based on my unconscious past psyche, is really going to create that same emotions, feelings, and behaviors within me that my person in my past had created. Okay, so that's transferentially, right? Countertransference is this because of that response that my body has gone through, or this because of the response that this person is inducing in me, I start behaving in the same manner as that person. So for example, there's a client and a therapist. Okay. So the client is, imagine if it's like a 15-year-old male boy client, procrastination issues, and has a tough relationship with father, right? Imagine that. right? And the client becomes, the therapist is the male therapist. That then what happens is that as soon as the client is in front of the male therapist, what happens is that the client starts to transfer his feelings of um, his feelings of what? His feelings of acceptance, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be anger towards the therapist, which is being projected on as the father figure. Now what happens is that the therapist has his own world, right? And in that own world, the client, he starts to enact the same feelings that the client starts to feel, and that's where the countertransference takes place. So I know I'm kind of uh, too many different pieces, too many different moving parts, and it might be feeling a little bit more confusing. Let me kind of draw it out, and I'm hoping that drawing it out would kind of actually make it a little bit more clearer for everyone. Okay, so imagine this is the client. Let's give it a C. Okay, and imagine this is the therapist. Okay. Now imagine that the therapist has his own history, right? You can call it history. Okay. And the client has his own history. Okay. Up now what happens is that when these guys come into a room, okay, when these guys come into a room, right, the client, the therapist will bring his own history into the room, the client will bring his own history into the room. So the way they will be seeing each other, you can imagine these as like eyes, will be based on their own histories. I hope this is as clear as that. Okay. Now what happens is that the client, right, might have a split, right? So what that means is that the client might be dissociating or might not be aware of, or it might be unsafe to actually feel some of the feelings or some of the memories or the histories that were there in the client, right? So for example, imagine that there's a split that's there, right? Okay. Imagine that the split that's there, right? So the client is, imagine, aware, right, of some of the things that are happening, right? And their client is then a little bit of a sort of like unaware, right, of some of the things that are happening for him, right? So for example, what that means is that the client is able to see, right, able to see some part of their history that they are safe with, that their ego identity is safe with, right? And so when they're having a conversation with the client, the therapist, they're coming from this space. Okay. Then what happens is they also have a split in them where they're also unaware of some of the experiences that they might not be able to see, but it's present in the room with them. Okay. Similar to the client, the therapist also has that same history, right? So this therapist is, and that's one of the reasons why we've talked about personal development and all of those things and self-awareness and how important all of those things are from the start, because we want to mitigate any splits that are taking place from the therapist side, right? Because it's the therapist's job to be aware of these things. And so the therapist could be aware of some of their own history, and the therapist could be unaware of some of their own history. But this is what's all happening in the room together, right? So all of this is taking place in the room. So whether you want to bring it or not, it doesn't matter. It's coming in with you. Whether you are aware of it or not, it doesn't matter. It's coming in with you, right? So these are all the parts that are really playing out when we are looking at it from a transferential lens. We are looking at it from a object relations lens or transference and countertransference. Because what happens for a lot of people is that they get surprised. And I don't want to be, I don't want to be, not political is not the right word, but like, um, I want to be mindful because I think this is information that's very relevant to the current times and the stuff that is happening in the news as well, in terms of boundary issues and in terms of all of these other things that are happening in the mental health community. It's all of these things that we have to be very mindful for so that we can mitigate it, so that we can protect ourselves, so that we can have professional boundaries and all of those things. Because my intention in showing all of this is to really help you guys to understand what is really going on here. Why do these things happen? Why do these maladaptive malpractices takes place? And what's really happening underneath the surface? Even for the therapists, so for those who are not in their own therapy or haven't done their own personal work, there's a lot of things about their own psyche they might be split from. So what happens is that they are not able to. So for example, imagine, let's start from the client. So the client sees what they're aware of when it comes to the room itself, right? And so they are able to identify, identify some of their issues, right? So, for example, I have a bad relationship with my mother, father, doesn't matter, right? So they're aware of it, they're able to identify these things, right? And because they're able to identify it, they're able to bring it into this conversation. Imagine, for example, when it comes to their mother's relationship or father's relationship or whatever their issues are, they're able to identify their anger. However, they are split from it could be, imagine they could be split from their grief, right? Or they could be split from their memory, particularly one particular memory, right? All of that stuff, but it's still in the room, okay? And so they are not able to identify this, but it's still present in the room. The room is all of this stuff, right? So the room is everything that's happening in the therapy room, okay? Now, same thing with the therapist. So a therapist भी इंसान होता है, right? So what that means is that if they have not done their work, right, they are not able to identify, right? They are able to identify some of the things within themselves, and thus they're able to identify some of the things that are happening with the client. However, if they are split, that means they have not done their own work, right? Then what happens is that then they are split from their own feelings of grief and all of that stuff taking place as well. Up now, what happens is that this is where transference and countertransference comes in, right? So what happens is that, let me give you an example. Client is talking about the moving that's kind of taking place, right? The client has shifted, right? And they're able to identify and they're aware of how much of a strain that has caused in his relationship with his family. Okay. However, the client is unaware of the anger, resentment, grief, or particularly how the shift happened, right? That it happened suddenly and they did not like it, and there was a certain kind of a traumatic experience that kind of took place in that process. Okay. Now imagine the therapist is able to kind of identify from their own personal history that transitions were tough, but they themselves also were not aware of um, how um, how how they did not talk to their family about the transition also, right? And that transition could be different. It could be about generally things about from their own family. And so what happens is the therapist is um, only able to identify all the anger or all the stuff that's there, but they're not able to really get to the places of the work because they are not able to get to the places of the work. However, what happens is that this is the work that needs to get resolved. Okay. And so in the sessions, what happens is that what happens with particularly with trauma also, what happens is that there is a repetition that starts to take place. There's an enactment that starts to happen. What happens is that the grief or the experiences that want to get resolved, they start doing the same behaviors in the room, right? And that can help them get results. For example, they start to freeze, they start to cry, they start to flirt, they start to throw a tantrum. And what happens is that the therapist then, because they are unaware of their own kind of experiences, is not able to pick up what the client is really trying to do here in order to resolve it. And what they are doing is that they are having a conversation on just the superficial level of what they're able to identify. That's it. Okay. And transference is purely about being able to see what is this relationship or this room being used for, right? Because for a lot of therapists, what happens is that they take the client's material personally. Okay, they think it's about them. It has nothing to do with them. Transference is basically understanding on a deeper level why the client is coming to therapy and what is the work that has to be done in order to really understand the resolution that is required for which the therapist is being used for. Okay. Let me recap to make it simpler, right? Because I think with a lot of the words and a lot of the technical terms, people are might be getting confused, but I'm hoping that we get the message across. Okay. Transference is not just about I project my feelings onto you, feelings that I might be able to identify, projective identification, therapist is able to identify it, or the feelings that might be split from, right? It's not just about that. It's about understanding what does that mean, right? Okay, if the client is projecting their grief or anger or emotions onto the room, right? And they're saying, no, I want you to pause and I want you to just hear me out. And I don't want you to kind of say anything or do anything. I just want you to sit and listen to me. Okay. Because that was what was needed for that grief. Okay. However, what happens is that because the therapist is unaware of their own emotions and feelings, they are unable to do so, and thus they are splitting again. And what they're doing is they're trying to stop them. They're trying to make sure that they don't interfere. They don't. They kind of quietly sit down and listen without actually building the acknowledgement, right? Because, for example, imagine, let's take this example, right? Imagine if the client is not able is not aware that the reason why they are flooding in the therapy room is because they have unresolved grief that wants to come out. What they are identifying is that the reason why they are flooding is because they felt unheard. Okay. So there is a difference in the treatment based on those two things, right? So, for example, if the client feels unheard, right, and that's what they're able to identify, then technically what the therapist has to do is just sit and listen, right? And that should ideally be able to resolve the gestalt or provide the resolution that the client is looking for. However, that is not the case, right? What you see is that even though the client is saying to the therapist that I want to just be heard, because that was what was missing in my life, that is the client coming from whatever awareness they have and they have been able to identify it. However, if the therapist, imagine, is able to see more of themselves, they will be able to see more of the client. They will be able to understand that it's not just the feeling of being unheard, it's also the specific feeling of not being given enough space to grieve. Okay. And then the therapist will then understand that I don't have to just sit and listen to them because that is not what is creating the resolution. I have to bring their grief into this awareness so that they stop splitting from it. And that will help them integrate and create the resolution that they are looking for in TEGRATE. I'm really hoping it starts to make sense after I kind of use this a little bit more in TEGRATE. Okay, integrate. Yeah. Okay, wow. And that is the work of the therapist, right? And that is what the therapist has to do. Because what happens is that as long as the therapist is just doing all of this superficial work, right, and not really understanding what is being enacted into the room, you're just going to bring on the client is just going to continue to come again and again and again and again, and they're just going to continue to hope that with the awareness that the client has about what their experience is, they're going to let the client therapist know, and the therapist is going to be able to understand these things, right? And they're hoping that, oh, if I just resolve this thing, this is how it's going to work. I hope that's true. However, that's not something that happens, right? It's important for the client to really understand, because usually these things happen because of a traumatic incident. Anytime a split happens, it is because at that time, it was very difficult for the body to accept what was happening. And thus, the split or dissociation or any of those other things are what is needed in order for the psyche or the ego to be protected, right? If you have a memory lapse, if you're unable to kind of remember anything, kudos, man, your body is trying to protect you. No issues, right? However, the body is so amazing that it will try as soon as it understands that, okay, now the client is old enough, they might have some resolve or resilience or awareness or the capacity, and they have a certain room in which they can actually treat themselves. Then what happens is that all of these unresolved emotions, they start to kind of spill over. They start to come into the forefront as behaviors in order to create that resolution. And this is what the therapist has to be able to see. That is the purpose of transference and countertransference, right? That the therapist uses their own. So I'll kind of give it, right? So what will happen is that the therapist will have to use their own body, their own understanding, or their own psyche in order to understand what is it that is required from me in this relationship. Okay. What is the client looking for, right? Okay, so for example, the client says to the therapist, okay, that I'm here because I'm here because I had a very difficult relationship with my family, and that's something that's being kind of wanting to, that's something that I want to kind of resolve, right? Okay. Now what happens is the therapist is now always countertransference, right? Transference and countertransference. So what happens now is that the therapist is now being used as a object, right? That is safe, right? That is able to kind of support the client, right? Safe and supportive, as this is safe and supportive for the client to do this work, right? Okay. However, what happens is that in the client's history, that it has never really, for example, imagine that in the client's history, people who were safe and supportive were not really kind of proficient and were not really kind of effective, right? Now imagine the therapists themselves have their own history, right? And imagine they don't like, they don't like being controlled. Imagine that, right? Or they don't like being told what to do, right? Because of their own personal history. Or imagine if it's easier that way, that they are perfectionists, right? Perfectionists, or they have a history of codependency, right? Stuff that is normal as a human being to have to work through, right? Like no human being is perfect, right? So every human being has their own history that they might be split from, right? And it's important for the therapist to be very well aware of at least what certain parts are, okay? Because my intention is to share how do you pick up if this is something that is happening transferentially or not, okay? And these are so many moving parts that are in play here, right? And I really want to be able to build the capacity of the therapists who are working that they need to be able to see this. And I will be very honest, when I was told this in the first time, I was like, what a headache, right? This is too much information, too many moving parts. I don't get this stuff, right? This is too many. I don't want to do it. It's better that I am split from whatever is coming in front of me rather than me having to accept that I have a psyche or an unconscious part that gets played out in the therapy room all the time, right? Because if I was to accept that, what that means is that I have to be then accountable for what am I bringing into the room, or at least, even if they're not resolved, have a cataloging of it in some way or the other. Screw that. I'm just gonna be like, मुश्किल है, मैं नहीं कर सकता. This is too much. I should like. This is, I think, really basic, not basic. This is, I think, something which is very important, right? And it's very important to be aware of this, have a good grasp of it. If you feel that my way of explaining it is too haphazard or too disorganized, read a book, right? Klein's book on Lenny Klein's book on object relations. There are some really good books nowadays about how to use this information transference. If you really want to start somewhere, start from Yolum, right? Gift of Therapy, Love's Executioner. It talks about these kind of unaware parts of the therapist that they themselves bring into the room, which can create unsafety for the client and the therapist, right? And this is the most important thing that you have to kind of be aware of. There are reasons why I'm not bringing sort of like certain examples, which I would bring into a smaller training because I'm not sure about how everyone will be kind of perceiving this information, right? So I'm trying to keep it as not PG, but as like clean as possible in terms of examples as well. So I think that's another thing that's kind of limiting in terms of the relevancy for it, right? But okay, let's try and kind of keep on using these vocabularies just to get a better understanding of transference and countertransference and what really takes place in the room, what is being projected onto the therapist, what really needs to be seen by the therapist, and how does that take place. Okay. So imagine if the client is identifying and aware of that they are coming in from that they had difficulty growing up when it comes to their transitions, right? And that's something that's there. However, they're split from their grief, right? So they don't like grieving. That's something that they're. So, for example, was it a difficult thing? No, it was great. I had good family support. I was able to kind of support it. What I was having difficulty with was that I didn't have too many friends that imagine that's the kind of narration, right? And imagine if that's the stuff that the client is bringing into the room. The room is very important, right? It's so important to depersonalize the work because the therapist sometimes because the client is showing the therapist parts of themselves, it becomes personal. For example, if I was to continue, imagine this is the situation that comes in, right? You start to notice that the therapist, if even if it's not a literal situation, they've had their own experiences with transitions and endings. Anyone has had, right? And they are themselves split from their experience as well, right? And so what you start to see is that the client, in order to stay split from their experiences of anger, uses sort of like a wall of words, right? And all they're doing is talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, because they think that that's the stuff that they felt that they never got to express. Okay. However, in all of that talking, they are still not connecting to the grief. They are not able to connect to it on an emotional level, on a physical level, the stuff that it takes. And we have a whole day on grief work, right? So after developmental immaturity, which is going to be the next one, and love addict, love avoidant about addiction stuff, that's going to be the second, the ninth one. We're going to have a whole day on grief, right? And so imagine if the client is unable to understand, or the therapist is unable to understand, what does it take, identify to what does it take to heal from grief. Imagine they have no awareness about that, right? And so what they're thinking is, okay, let's talk about it, let's talk about it, let's talk about it. And they're talking and flooding, right? Which means that their body does not have the capacity to integrate. What you start to notice is that there is such, so that's coming from the client side. The therapist, because of their perfectionist codependencies, for example, if imagine if they're not aware of their own perfectionism and codependencies, in order to help the client, just stays quiet. How does that make you feel? Right? And they themselves are unaware about their own grief. Okay. What do you think will happen? Because all of this is being done to resolve the grief, right? That's what all of this is being done. All of this is being done so that this grief, right, finally gets to see the light of day. That's what they're here for. Whether they have the awareness for it or not, their body wants to resolve this grief. And they are like, oh my God. And just the client thinks that the way to resolve the grief is through talking, right? Or sharing. And this is just an example. However, the more they talk, the more they are avoiding sort of like all of the experiences that they have gone through, because that is too painful for them and that would be difficult for them. And thus they are keeping it here. So the grief wants to come out, but the client's protective parts are just trying to keep them at bay. Right? ये सब चीजें सामने नहीं दिख रही होती. Right? These are all the things that the therapist has to be aware of, present for, looking at the languaging, looking at the words, having read things, having done the homework, having done their own work. They're like, okay, yaar, yahan ja raha hai ye client. This is where the work is going, right? The work is going not in terms of just being able to talk. It's going in terms of, wanting to resolve this grief. And can you imagine what will happen, because this grief will really try to come out, right? It will try, and guess what it will do? It will try, and what it will do is it will cause flooding, right? It will cause a lot more intensity, right? And the therapist, in order, if that's something that they have their perfectionist parts, they will kind of come forward, and all they will do is, from whatever capacity that they know, they will try to regulate, they will try to sell. But if the therapist is unaware of how to work with their own grief, it's not going to help, right? Because the therapist is split from going there, right? And thus it becomes a challenge. It will feel good. Why will it feel good? Because you have a person that is providing oxytocin. You have a certain relationship that's there with the therapist as well. So you have some form of dopamine and connection and or relational stuff that's kind of taking place, which can help the client feel good, but not get better. There's a huge difference between clients feeling good and getting better, right? And I think it's very important for therapists to understand. And you know how many times, I think it's from day one, right? Like day one, session one, I'm like, therapists, go to your therapy, be aware of what, even if you don't go to your therapy, read a book, right? Read a book, figure it out, do some stuff that understands how do I get this line to move? How do I, you will never be like, I don't know if it's possible to ever be fully integrated, right? And I don't think that's the expectation as well, right? I don't think the expectation is that. I think what usually happens is that the client's stuff usually helps the therapist identify some of their own stuff. That's what happens, right? And when they start to identify some of their own stuff, they become less split, right? They become less split and they become more integrated. And that helps the therapist become better and provide better treatment. Because then what happens is that you cannot ever, I don't know, I'm sure therapists who've been there long enough, they have reached that stage, but most therapists will go in with this process that they are being able to see what the client's work is. It activates them, right? Because they get frustrated that, oh my God, why am I not able to get help with this client? This client is coming into me nonstop, but she is not able to kind of get through with it. I don't know what's wrong. Why is this happening? You can see their own parts. I want to help the client, but I'm not able to help the client kicking in. And that is where, if they were to go to supervision, right? The supervisor is able to see this whole situation that's happening, right? They can become a resource that can help the client, as is an I, right? That can help the client, the therapist identify, okay, is this something that you're split from, right? And then if this is something that you're split from, right, then is that something that is taking place? And if you were to resolve this for yourself, would you be able to help the client resolve these things? That is the work. That is the work, right? Because what is and how is the client being able to, how is the supervisor able to see all of these things? The main reason is, the main way is called intensity. When there is psyche, right, intensity, right? When there is this psyche, right? When there is these kind of forces, Freud, right, that are trying to come out, trying to resolve, there is this kind of pressure that's getting built. There is a certain intensity that starts taking place in the room, right? And it could be emotional intensity, it could be anger, fear, frustration. It starts to, because it knows that that's how it comes out, right? It knows that as soon, because I want to be in the forefront, I don't want to be in the background anymore. I want to resolve this. There is a part of the client that knows that that's what they're here for, right? That they want to be able to identify what this experience has caused, created for them, and that's what they want to be able to do. However, so what happens is that these emotions, they start to create a certain level of intensity. That intensity can create enactments. Okay. So can you imagine, and this is so, you'd be surprised. You get the clients or you get the therapist also that you are, it's not surprising for therapists to say that the client's work mirrors my own work. It's not surprising. It's not surprising because there is this kind of pull, and you can call it energetic pull. This is this kind of pull that is very visible consistently when it comes to this work, right? That sometimes the therapist is not able to, I've seen so many times when therapists are so afraid of harming the client, right? And their own parts are so overwhelmed by clients themselves because of either their perfectionism or their codependency. And these are just generalized words. There could be many other reasons for this to happen, right? That they don't take on clients, right? They're just too overwhelmed by it. And what they want is they want them to just not come. I don't want you to come anymore, right? Because what the clients do is that they show the therapist parts of themselves that they're split from. And that's an uncomfortable process. It's also very intense, right? And this feeling of the client not wanting to come is sometimes a very intense feeling that is there. I wish I'm just too tired. I just don't want them to come today. I'm so exhausted. I just feel like, it's just too much. I just feel so nervous, or I just feel so scared. I feel so ashamed. It could be many different things. However, what's really happening is that all of these intensities are emotions that the work is evoking in the therapist. So, for example, you start noticing that the therapist starts to say that I wish the client doesn't come. I wish it's too much. I really hope. Oh, the client is. It's a very difficult client, right? That's a very common one. It's a very difficult client, right? It's a client that's too overwhelming. What's happening is that the therapist A has to have the resources to be able to depersonalize this feeling if it's so intense. Without depersonalizing this feeling, which is so intense, the therapist sees this as just about them. No, it's not. The therapist wasn't feeling this way until the client came, right? So it's not that the therapist felt that way in the first session or the second session. No, it felt that way once the session started to come up, once a particular stage kind of came on, that's when the therapist starts to feel this way. What that means is that the therapist has to depersonalize and say, okay, this feeling that I'm having with the client or towards the client, right? Is this feeling something that is evoked in me by the client? Is this a feeling that I'm picking up from the clients? Or is it a feeling that the client induces in others? Right? And if that is so, how can I help understand what is the client's work when it comes to this particular feeling? Okay. Client induces transferentially difficulty, the feeling that I is difficult, right? So is that client's own personal hopelessness and helplessness that the therapist is picking up? Okay. If that is true, then is that information about what the client has kind of gone through in terms of their own experiences? Is that why these feelings are so intensely kind of hidden behind this wall of split? Is that what the work is? Is that the feeling that I don't want to address these things? And that's one of the reasons why I am not sure, right? And I don't want to kind of deal with this stuff. Is that why the therapist is picking up these feelings? Okay. But that awareness will only take place, A, with time, with experience, but with an understanding that it's not about the ego of the therapist. This is how you understand transference and countertransference and understand what the work is about, what is needed by the client, right? So at this stage, we're just mapping out how to understand what is transferentially kind of being projected onto the therapist. How is the therapist able to understand this by depersonalizing and then use it to understand what the client's map is so that they can provide effectiveness of treatment? Okay. You, no matter what modality you're a part of, trauma informed, humanistic, gestalt, CBT, if you're not aware of this, you can't, in my opinion, you can't provide effectiveness of treatment. I don't think it's possible, right? Because you're missing out so much of the work. What I usually see happening is that imagine if the client is feeling anger that if the client is feeling anger that they're split from. Okay. So anger that they have not yet identified because of the experiences that they have gone through, they are able experiencing anger. Okay. Towards the parental figure. Just keep it simple. Okay. And then what happens is that so overtly they say that I like this therapeutic relationship very much, right? I really enjoy the work, and that's why I'm coming to the therapist regularly, right? They're consistently at that kind of stage. However, what happens is that they are able to identify the therapist. However, what happens is that the therapist starts to feel anger towards the client, right? And it's in a very strong intensity also, right? It has a very strong intensity. They start to feel anger towards the situation in terms of the workspace that they're working at, or they're starting to feel anger. They're starting to feel a lot of anger, right, in their physiology. Okay, it's very important if there is intensity. And intensity is the information because these are the things that are in our psyche are trying to come out. If there is intensity of this anger, that means that it's more than average, right? Like, for example, if the therapist is picking up anger towards their own family members, right? But it doesn't need to be this angry, right? Like the therapist is noticing that their mood or something that's activating them is a lot more, right? They're getting a little bit more at the 11, right? And so it's very important to pick that up, right? Oh, okay, how come I'm getting so activated towards my mother? Okay. And how come I'm getting activated towards all of these feelings? And then when you do a little bit of a check-in, and that will only happen if you're trying to not split from those feelings. If you do a little bit of a check-in, you start to realize that, oh man, I'm actually carrying the anger of the client, which they had split from because of their experiences. Because this anger wants to come out. It's the unsaid anger. But the client does not feel safe, and that's why they're split, to address this anger. And so what they do is that they transfer it onto the therapist, right? And they give it to the therapist somatically, through mirror neurons, all of that stuff. They give it to the therapist to hold. And the therapist, if they are split from it, or they are not aware of it, or they don't understand what their processes are, they will start to enact certain behaviors that will mirror the client's environment also. However, if the therapist is able to understand this whole mechanism that, okay, I am a therapist, which means that I work with feelings and emotions, which means that I am actually working with my clients' feelings and emotions. And sometimes, if they are unsafe to carry these feelings and emotions, they will project them or transfer them onto me. And that's why I will carry it. And sometimes, if I am unaware or if I'm split from these feelings, I will notice them with certain intensities. However, if I'm able to identify projective identification, right? If I'm able to identify what these feelings are, right? And then be able to actually hold them, regulate them, deal with them. I can ask certain questions that can make it safe for the client. I can model it for the client to deal with these things as well. And that is what will help him identify or her identify these things and remove the split, help resolve trauma, create the work. I really hope that the story is kind of making sense a bit by bit by bit by bit in terms of how this stuff really works. And it's so important to have at least some level of understanding about these things, right? Because otherwise, and this is something that I know, right, that we might be underserving our client, right? We might not be providing the full treatment that is required for us as practitioners, mental health practitioners, to provide. Number one, underserving the client, big issue. Great. Okay. Second, enactment issues, right? And this is where I want to kind of go into the second part of it, right? The therapist, right? And okay, I'll be brave. I'll say it. You know, with the situation that happens with maladaptive boundaries with clients. Okay, this is how as brave as I could be. right? Maladaptive boundaries with clients. Okay, so the therapist, right, has their own history. Okay, and what happens is that if they are split, okay, these histories could be sexual in nature, they could be relational in nature, they could be anything, right? And so what happens is that if the therapist is split, right? If this therapist is split from these things, I wanna show how enactment takes place, right? Because enactment is very powerful, and I want to share it particularly from a trauma lens also. Okay. So what happens is the therapist has stuff that wants to come forward also, right? So therapist has stuff. It doesn't have to be grief. It could be, let's imagine what else could it be, right? Stuff that people have unresolved in their lives. It could be father relationships, abandonment, abandonment with male figures, right? Could be anything. It could be, let's just do more, right? Abandonment with male figures. It could be, let's do abandonment with female figures, right? It could be, what else could it be? It could be more, man. It could be so many other things as well. These are just certain kind of basic examples of unresolved things that are humanly okay to have, right? No one escapes childhood unscathed, right? It could be abandonment, it could be enmeshment, it could be sort of like, I know one which is very important, right? Value, right? Associated with action, conditional love, right? Like, if you do this, if you are a good child, then you are good enough, right? Agar मैं आपकी मदद करूंगी तो मैं सही हूँ, right? Like all of that unconscious stuff that everyone carries. And it's okay. It's okay. Like no one's asking anyone to be sadhu, right? Like no one expects anyone to be sadhu. It's just about ये हमारा काम. This is our job. Our job is to understand the psyche, right? कि यार मेरे दिमाग में क्या चल रहा है जिसकी वजह से मुझे अपने बारे में क्या पता है, ताकि मैं सामने वाले शख्स को समझ सकूं और उनके दिमाग में क्या चल रहा है वो मैं समझ सकूं. जिसकी वजह से psychoanalysis or even for example all of that stuff was all based on the idea of the analyst working on themselves first for 7 years, right? To really understand what is happening so that they could be a clean slate in front of the client. Okay. So what happens is that the therapist has their own story, right? And these things are there, right? Whether they're aware of it or not, whether they want to openly answer the answers or not, right? So they have all of these stories. Whether it's their issues with relationships, whether it's their issues with value, time it doesn't. My intention is not to go into, sorry about the noise. My intention is not to go into what is the stuff that is happening. My intention is it could be anything. Uh, it could just be like dot 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 dot. You can fill in whatever content you want to give it, right? It doesn't really matter. The issue is that the way enactment works is that all of this stuff is wanting to come forward and get resolved also. All of this stuff also wants to get resolved. Always, right? Because these are unconscious forces that are motivating the therapist's behavior and actions. And the risk happens is कि जब ये चीजें client के साथ आ रही होती. So for example, the 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 abandoned male figure, right? So the therapist wants, imagine that the client is a male, right? So the therapist and the client is let's just move male also. right? So the therapist is, what does it do? They try unconsciously to make sure that the client just stays, right? That they are there and they are safe and they are not going anywhere. And so what happens is, I'll tell you a sad part of this. So technically what happens is that even though that's what they want, okay, even though that is what they want, the muscle memory or the enactment is of them leaving. So the client, the therapist will do what they think from their awareness is what could have resolved that situation. And thus they become codependent or compliant or do all those things. Like, let's just say boundary issues. Okay. And they start having boundary issues, giving extra time, paid cancellations go away. You're kind of open to having the therapist be more lenient, koi masla nahi hai, and all of those things. However, and this is where the painful part comes in, right? The client will still, because of whatever map, leave. Because that is the enactment that the therapist is going through, right? Because I'll be very honest, the resolution to an abandoned male figure is not the current male figure staying, right? No matter what the client therapist would do, whether the client wouldn't stay, because that would be energetically also something that will be part of their map, and it will misattune technically also, because the therapist is unconsciously using the client for their own personal unconsciously use, right? So the client will not actually feel the benefit of the therapist's work, all of those things. But in actuality, the resolution of the abandoned male figure isn't the therapist having boundary issues, it's the therapist being able to accept that, right? So there's a grief there, right? Or the therapist is able to kind of acknowledge, right, that there was a wounding that happened, right? And that work, that painful work, right, is what will help the therapist create that resolution. And thus, once they do that work, they are able to actually have the boundaries that they're needing, right? They're able to actually create the boundaries, uh, and not let sort of like their own unconscious psyche influence that stuff. This is what it takes, man. And this is why this work is like so painful and so hard and so difficult. And this is why therapists need to like be aware that what work they're doing is not just I want to sit in front of a person, take their history, write their diagnosis. Like a lot of therapists have never done therapy themselves. There's a certain level of dissociation from all of these things. And when they start to counsel, they get confronted with these feelings, dot feelings, right? And they start to enact, because they're like, how come I actually did so much for my client and the client still kind of left? Or let's just do a variety, right? So or it's not, even if it's not like how come the client left, imagine if it's more about like abandonment, where you would kind of imagine if it's more about um imagine if it's more about criticism. Criticism with female figures, right? Like imagine if it's that, and imagine if the client is female, right? And that's the work that's kind of taking place, right? And you get to see that no matter, and so the therapist, anything that the client says, the therapist is just trying to be very kind of kind and nice and perfectionist, and making sure everything is being done. And you will notice that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That the therapist action evokes, because the therapist carrying that feeling within themselves, the therapist transfers it onto the client, that the feeling will actually get evoked to be more critical, and it again creates that enactment also. It's non-stop. This is the reason why people burn out. This is the reason why people don't do this work. They leave because they think that not a lot of people have this capacity to work, and not a lot of people see these things. But this is what is the most important reason and for creating clinical effectiveness, right? Because once you have an understanding of this whole map, right? Once you have an understanding of all of these different moving parts, that okay, that the client has a awareness of their own history that they're able to identify, and a little bit of their history that they're able to be unaware of, right? And whatever reasons there were for those splits to happen, it's their body's way of coping. Similarly, the therapist has their own history, something that they're aware of, some parts they're unaware of, and they have their own experiences that they split from. Okay. When they come into the room, they bring all of those khicharis together. And what happens is that there is a chance that these unconscious parts, they want to get resolved in the therapy room. And in order for them to get resolved, the therapist has to be able to see these things play out. And when they see these things play out, the therapist is the conduit or the ये काम मतलब हमारी training है, client की तो training है नहीं, right? So I'm not going to expect this work to happen by the client. I'm going to expect this work to happen by the therapist, right? Because this is what they're getting trained in, right? And so when they get aware of these things, right, they are able to understand, oh, okay, so this is this sort of like, sorry, my bad. Is this mine, or is this intensity that I'm feeling theirs? Or is it coming from their history that they're aware of or unaware of? And am I able to tolerate it because I am able to tolerate my own history? And once that is established in the room, right? Once the goalpost is clear, this is what needs to happen for therapy for it to be effective. Then you get to go to the end, right? I heard therapists. I was one of those also, very honestly. Therapy happens for years and years and years and years, and I'm like, and again, I was one of those therapists also, right? And the only reason why it's happening for years and years and years and years is because the therapist is split from their parts. And if they are in supervision, very honestly, supervisors can be splits of them, right? Supervisors also have their own history that they are split from, right? So it's a cycle, right? And that's one of the reasons why supervisors have supervision and all of those things as well, right? So if you're noticing that the therapist is not able to provide treatment in a decent amount of time. A year is a decent amount of time, right? A year is a decent amount of time. अगर एक साल के अंदर आप नहीं कर पा रहे, 2 साल के अंदर आप काम नहीं कर पा रहे, that means something else is happening, right? That means that the real work is not being addressed, and everyone is feeling good. No one is getting better, right? And I know it's a blanket statement, and I want to be very mindful of that blanket statement, but that is something that I really hope that you guys are able to understand that this mechanism is always at work, always at work, always at work. If you want to identify when, just pick up intensity. Intensity is what these unconscious modalities use when they're trying to come in. They're trying to, because they're not regulated, they're not integrated, वो लोग बोलते हैं दरवाजा खोलो, right? And so you get like a burst of anger, sadness, grief, relationship issues. आपके खुद के, and the therapist has to be mindful, right? You have to be mindful about what needs to kind of happen, because this is where your self-care kicks in. This is where you are able to be mindful of, okay, right? So I'm noticing this intensity within me. I'm aware, emotionally regulate, able to kind of address these things as part of my professional work and my requirement. So what I will do is I will go to supervision. or I will check in with myself and I'll be like, okay, is this intensity coming because of what my work is with a particular client? And if I was to be very honest, and this is something that I tell the therapist to kind of do as well, if you're noticing a certain feeling with intensity, okay, check in to yourself. And what you will notice is that if you're carrying someone else's emotions, and it doesn't always have to be the client, it could be your family members also. It could be your father, your mother, all of those people as well. And if you're carrying your emotion, someone else's emotions, because that's a human phenomena that anyone can do, right? What you will notice is that you can visualize their face. For example, what am I carrying? Um, Imagine if I'm carrying therapists, right? Like imagine if I'm carrying sort of like their concerns and fears and all of those things. I run a center, right? So as soon as I check in, there is a certain awareness that I have, because my body isn't, even though it's designed to have empathy, and even though it's designed to have understanding of what the other person's emotions are and what they are able and willing to go through, I don't have the capacity to live with those feelings, which are not my own, right? And that is what creates burnout. And one of the main things that is very important is that once this work is done, and once you're able to see this work at this level, it's very important for you to shut it off also, right? You need to be able to have this understanding or skill set within yourself to clear up transferences as well. When you go home, don't carry your clients with you. One good indicator of that is if you're thinking about them consistently. Okay. If you're noticing a shift in your behaviors very actively, right? So you've noticed yourself become very dorsal, right? Or your exhaustion levels or your freeze response has gotten up, right? So you're dealing with clients who have high freeze and suddenly your own freeze gets up, or you've noticed your relationship, any shift. This is, again, you might notice or you might feel that, um, uh, that this is intense or this is too much in terms of awareness. However, it's very important because this is the work that sometimes creates a lot of burnout for people, because they're living and carrying clients and their unresolved work, which is matching their own personal unresolved work, and they don't have the resources or the support or the information or the language on how to clean this up. No, all your traumas are not going to get resolved today, right? All your clients' traumas are not going to get resolved today. You're on a journey to become more self-aware. Your clients are going to go show you stuff. You are going to get triggered. You are going to get activated. You need to be able to have the toolkit within you that just in case that activation takes place, आपके पास आपके safe net लोग हैं, आपके पास आपके resources हैं, आपके पास आपके regulation tools हैं, आपके पास, and this is the thing that I really enjoy, logs हैं, right? Use, like, I know I have, like, how do I say this? Again, I have to be so technical in terms of the way I language things, right? I am aware of how logs are used as case studies, right? So, for example, what that means is I need a long paragraph about everything that happened in the session, verbatim, wall of words, right? And that is not, probably that's the way I'm taught, but that's not my ask, right? I'm asking you to write your logs in a manner that helps you better understand your relationship with the client. What is your client using, and that's the right word, you for? What is your own stuff that could be coming into the room? And how is all of this fitting together? How is all of this fitting together? What is the different elements that are there that are being kind of shown and seen of my own, of the client? Why are we working together? What's the purpose? Why did this client choose this therapist And why did this therapist, what skills or resources does this therapist need to kind of resolve from their own experiences to help the client through their own? And you'll be surprised, and I'll be very honest. Once this mindset shifts, right, that it has less to do with client ko badalna hai and more to do with मैं क्या देख सक रहा हूँ, right? What am I able to see within myself and within the client? What happens is that there's a certain level of there's a lack of blame that goes on to the client because there's no expectation from the client to shift, because whatever the client is doing, they're doing it from a capacity that they needed to do it in. They did not have the resources, right, to be able to resolve it, and thus the split happened, right? Do I have the resources to resolve it first? And if I had the resources and if I've done that work, can I break it down into smaller steps that can help be shared with the client in a manner that is actually doable for them? So for example, client has unresolved grief work, hypothetically, which they're kind of intensely bringing in terms of wall of words. Okay. Then do I have the capacity to tolerate a wall of words? Or am I feeling shut down and am I feeling, are those parts getting triggered? Okay. Number one. So imagine if I am able to tolerate the wall of words, then I was able to think, okay, what question can I ask? So that they are able to relate to themselves more. Number one. Number two, okay, now I'm able to build a connection with the client through these questions, and now they're not in this wall of word anymore. Now, am I able to pick up what am I feeling to be able to use that information transference to help the client understand what is in the room? I'm noticing a lot of sadness as we're talking about these things. Is that what are you noticing from this? Right? Questions like this, which really help reduce that split, bring it into a safe awareness. Oh, okay. So you can see the amount of work that is taking place as you're doing. And i.e., this is what you call therapy, right? This is literally what therapy is. Your therapy as a therapist, this is what you're doing. And you can do it with whatever modality you prefer doing it with, right? You can do it as a CBT therapist. You can do it as a humanistic therapist. For example, if you're a humanistic therapist, you use all of this information of what's happening underneath the surface to actually create that space of, okay, this is what we need to kind of work through. And so in humanistic, you will kind of use those humanistic tools in terms of paraphrasing, in terms of empathy, in terms of unconditional positive regard. If you were Gestalt, you would kind of, okay, imagine if that grief, bring it into an empty chair. Let's put it in there. Let's try to solve those things out. That's the way you resolve these things. I am hoping that this information helps you become a better therapist in terms of keeping yourself safe first, right? So that when you're going through these intensities of emotions, you're not personalizing it. You're able to say, okay, is this mine or is this my client's or my family members? Right? Or am I carrying some of these emotions? Okay, I am carrying. That's why these intensity. Anytime there is intensity, click, 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 something is being carried, right? And it could be anger, family problems, stress, expectations, responsibilities, whatever, right? And that intensity will create an adaptive or mitigating kind of behavior shift. So you're always keeping an eye for that. Okay, so imagine all of that stuff is there. And then what you do is you try to kind of recognize, okay, how you don't directly throw it back to the client. If, for example, I'm able to pick up projected, transferred anger, okay, and I am able to regulate, and I'm able to, because I've done that work for myself, I'm able to go, okay, I know how to breathe through this, okay. I'm not going to be like, hey, aren't you throwing too much anger on me? There's so much anger on you. Why aren't you? Client might not have the capacity to integrate that. I can ask softer questions like, what's your relationship with anger? Psychodynamic questions like, how has anger been addressed in your family? What was it like what was it like to see anger in your childhood? How did you respond to anger in that manner? Curiosity. safety. What am I doing? I'm tolerating, right, the projection and the transference that is taking place through the resources and the work that I have done. And then based on that tolerance that I have developed, I am using the skills that I have in terms of my languaging, my questioning, my style of therapy to actually create insight for the client so that they can tolerate these feelings as well. That is the work. That is what psychodynamic is all about, right? Because in last one, right? Last one, because it's a lot in object relations, right? The child, client, sees things as binary, good breast, bad breast, good mother, bad mother, because their psyche, their developmental stage, they do not see gray. They see good, bad, right? I can tolerate, not tolerate, right? I will die if I am seeing my mother as a bad object, right? These are the psychic Kleinian stages of development that trauma or wounding kind of causes us to get stuck at, right? And what we start to realize is as we're getting more and more incrementally integrated, that it is not all black or white. So if my client sees me as a bad object, right? So for example, oh, wall of words, right? And I'm like, is it okay if I interrupt? No, 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 you're not letting me speak. And it is something that's really upsetting me. And I don't think that the projection of bad object, okay? So I go like, I understand that this is something that is important to you, and I want to make it as safe as possible for you. So is it possible if I can ask you questions about, as you are speaking, how is your body taking it? Care, right? And so you can see that there is this gray that I can set a boundary with you about your work and still care for you also, right? Which is where the work of Kleinian kind of therapeutic work of good object, bad object relations kind of kicks in, is because the therapist needs to have the capacity to not just always be good object, good object. Oh, आपको paid cancellation, yes, no problem. No. It's also about both. And it's not about always being a bad object as well. Then that's another piece of work that you have to figure out, right? How come you're so comfortable always being the bad object, right? So it's this gray that you have to learn to cope and develop within yourself so that you can be the person that your client needs you to be, right? I'm not like if you're being paid as a therapist, you're not being paid so that you resolve your unconscious psyche work, because that's jumping out into the room. You're being paid to solve the client's unconscious psyche work. So if they require holding, nurturing, care, right, and boundary structure and support, do that. But if they get activated, right, or they get reactivated because in their past experiences, boundaries and were considered very unsafe and abandonment in nature, then you need to be able to tolerate that feeling of rejection within yourself and be able to actually tell them that I'm here and still I'm going to set a boundary because I care, right? And so that gray is what is so important for psychodynamic work to be really like I would call it the bedrock of any kind of therapeutic case conceptualization, because if you are, in my opinion, not seeing this layers that are always playing out in the therapeutic room, your map of what the client needs from you as a therapist, why they're paying you, is like half. I would be like half, right? It's like are fully there, right? And we gotta work with this stuff, man. This is the stuff that we have to really make sure that we are competent in. And I highly recommend read books and get a supervisor and start seeing this work and build a tolerance for this work, because if a lot of people don't have this tolerance, and they start taking this thing so personally because they get activated and triggered by the client. And once they get activated and triggered by the client, they either enact or they abandon, right? Rescue or abandon. And in a trauma culture like Pakistan, it's so important to have these kind of tolerances. So all of that stuff is there. Yeah, this is a lot. Next week, right? Because now the stage of the training is all about case conceptualizations, right? So we've done a lot of the modality work, we've done a lot of the prerequisite self-care work that's required as well. Now we're going into, okay, the depth of the work, right? Meat and potatoes, just got both though, right? So we've done psychodynamic today. That's something that we have covered. The one that we're going to cover after that is going to be my favorite, which is called developmental immaturity. Developmental immaturity is a model of treatment that is designed for understanding, like having a better map of the history, like developmental trauma particularly, right? It comes from Pierre Melody's work of facing codependency, and that's something that we're going to be working on. And then after that, we're going to be working on addiction particularly. So those are the different stuff that we're going to be working on. I do want to ask, today was a lot, and if there are any questions that you have about today, I will be open to answering them also right now. If not, so I do want to give a minute to ask you guys, do you have any questions particularly from today's sessions? You guys can put it on the chat. If not, I would even invite you guys to send the questions in your email thread. I'm going to try my best to kind of respond from that email thread as well, so that people who are in the kind of resources and all of that stuff, we get to kind of share it actively and take care of it. So I hope you guys had some value from today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week on Friday as well. Okay, take care, guys. Is there a question? Yeah, sure. We can ask here. If you want, you can ask here, Sarosh. That would be great as well.
Okay, so my question was mostly about, the part that you said about intellectualizing, and you said that I really, really liked what you said when you said, it's really important to not really label in that moment and hold space for the client. And ये मेरी एक बहुत बड़ी confusion है, and I really, really struggle with understanding that. This is why I'm asking you this question. Okay, for example, if something comes up, right, like intense emotions, just like you said, could be, something is there. And in the moment, my first reaction would be to figure out what exactly is happening, right? Like I would take a moment and I would be like, acha, theek hai, like what's exactly happening here? So this sort of creates a confusion in my mind. When exactly is it called labeling, or when exactly is it called intellectualizing? And how do I figure out what's needed where? Because intellectualizing mein ye hota hai ki it's so convincing that I can just be in that train, and I can sometimes forget to feel the emotion, like मैं इतना जो है वो गायब हो जाती हूँ intellectualizing में कि I'm no longer able to understand exactly what the emotion is happening here, right? So just wanted to ask you about what you think. When do you think is the difference between the two that comes up? Whether I'm intellectualizing, whether I'm simply labeling, and what would be the sign that I need to look out for in order to sort of put a stop to that and be like, acha, theek hai, now you need to sit with the emotion. You need to soak yourself in that emotion for a minute.
So it's a very good question, right? Because on two levels. One, I have relatability with it as well, because that's something that I used to do, try to have awareness-based approaches, right? And so if there's any, and the shift happened for me when I started to use my body in the work as well, right? So we have our mind and we have our body, right? And they both have their own benefits. And if I'm fully present, what happens is I'm taking both of them into the room with me, right? So, and it again, it's a relationship with the body that is built. And the reason why, at least in my experience, what I've seen is that the mind comes first is because it's the one that's been used the most, right? And it's the one that has worked the most as well. It has given you results as well, generally, right? And so there is a trust that has to be developed with the body, because once you notice an intense emotion, right, there is, rather than the mind being the first response, right, the body and the urge to do is what has to be kind of tolerated first. As soon as that happens, right? As soon, because we have one nervous system, as soon as that happens, the body toleration takes place. Now I'm not going to be responding from a sympathetic fight or flight kind of mindset. Now I'm going to be responding from, hopefully, an evaluative mindset. Okay, do I still need to engage intellectually, or do I need to pivot, right? Do I need to kind of ask a more of a body-based question? I'm noticing these feelings coming up. Can I just have a minute to, disrupt the flow of the therapeutic work in that moment to create those distinctions? So those are some of the elements that I would suggest. And I do think that it comes with practice, and it's so important to use your body as like a barometer sometimes as well. There's a book called Learning from a Patient or Becoming a Person. It's one of the first books of humanistic counselings that I have read. And what they say is that as you develop yourself as a therapist, you start developing your own internal supervisor also. So you have this kind of two cones of awareness. You have this one person that's in the room with you, and you have the other awareness, which is your kind of supervisor sitting with you as well in your ear that says, okay, slow down. Okay, take a minute. There's like this autocorrect that kind of takes place. So, so that hopefully will help. Is that something that kind of helps answer that question particularly?
Yeah, it does. I think it, really explained exactly what I was sort of going for as well. कि वो जो एक therapist voice होती है अंदर, you need to really hone on that. You need to really sit with that. And I think another thing now अब जो मेरे दिमाग में आई है based on what you just said is कि how important it is to maintain an objective view even about yourself in situations like this, because it's so easy for you to extend empathy for others when you are a therapist in training. Hopefully that is the case, that you're able to extend empathy to others. Lekin it's really, really important to do the same for yourself as well, because agar, let's suppose the situation that you were describing in, agar isme my therapist training voice is like really judgmental, कि like, oh, why are you doing this? Matlab, why do you need a moment? Like, you're a therapist, you're not supposed to do that. So how damaging it can be for the overall relationship.
So it won't be your therapist's voice that says that is critical. It would be a layer underneath that also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there'll be a layer underneath that, right? And so, because even as your career is growing and developing, you want to be able to separate, because if you separate that stuff, now your therapist training voice could be different from that voice, right? And that could really benefit as you, because it will be a struggle, right? You will have challenges and you will grow through those challenges and all of those things. So that is something that will help as well, because and that is the work, right? That is what the role of a supervisor and all of those things are. Even books, it doesn't have to be supervisor. It can even be books, good books that you can read that can help you create that distinction that, okay, my therapist or the internalized therapist I have, what is the personality that I've already allotted to it? And how much of that is like my own stuff, right? And how can I kind of create that awareness? And in time, hopefully it kind of resolves itself out as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So again, these are really good questions. And I hope that, if you start asking yourself, because self-awareness is like the right kind of self-awareness, right? In which you are at peace with your broken parts, right? Like you're at peace with whoever you are, like you're complete. Like there was a word that was said, perfectly imperfect, right? So, oh, I have this bits that are there. I'm a little bit self-critical. I have a little bit of shame in me. I have a little bit of like my relationship with my body is in the off. I have a little of anger. Blah 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 blah. These different parts of me make me who I am. I'm aware of them. I'm not judging them. I'm aware of them. So whoever I am, I come to the therapy room as that. I'm not hiding, lying, or ashamed of any part of myself, hopefully. Right. And so when I am experiencing the client or working with the client, I have that empathy for them, because then I'm not going to shy away from looking at who they are as a person, right? Okay, they are all of these different parts that might be interacting with me and how I have to kind of work on with them, right? And so, yeah, I hope that this is there to first provide empathy for yourself, protect yourself in terms of, no, because once you're aware of these different parts, you will be much more intentional with your word choices, right? And that will help you hit home with your client work, and that will help you hit home with the questions you ask, and the effectiveness of treatment is the intention, right? Okay, how can I be curious about what makes my therapeutic work effective, right? How can I help that stuff? So I hope this was helpful, and I'm actually looking forward to our next one. Next one's going to be a lot more fun, I hope, right? And we just take it from next there. Take care, guys.